Welcome to Verbal to Visual. My name is Doug Neill, and today I'm going to be taking notes on an episode of The Knowledge Project, hosted by Shane Parrish. I'm listening to episode number 63, Winning at the Self-Publishing Game with Hugh Howey. I'll be taking these sketch notes on 9-inch by 12-inch paper with a Pentel Energel 0.7 pen. I've got a few index cards on the side here, just in case I want to draft some sketches before I commit them to the page. If you'd like to see how these sketch notes develop, then that's what's coming up next. But if you just want to see the takeaways about self-publishing, then jump to this timestamp. That's where I'll give a recap of the particular ideas that I choose to capture because I'm interested in self-publishing. The core of my business here at Verbal to Visual right now is based on online courses that teach the skills that I'm about to demonstrate, but I hope to do more writing in the future, and I imagine that self-publishing a book will happen at some point. So I feel like it's worth kind of gathering some best practices and understanding the current state of self-publishing to set myself up for success whenever that occurs. So I hope you enjoy the process and the takeaways. Let's get to it. So the way I chose to structure this note-taking session is with what I have called the brick road approach. I described that approach in a video I made a few years back. Essentially, I imagine these rectangles that I use to fill the page, one rectangle at a time, one brick at a time, as I capture each individual idea with some combination of words and visuals. And I give it the amount of space that it needs, and then as new ideas come in, I find a new rectangle in the space that's left to put that new idea. So that gives me a little bit of a constraint to work with as I'm deciding where to put any given visual or how to structure the words and phrases that I know that I want to get down. And there's some flexibility here to kind of extend a given rectangle if more ideas come. That was the case with this wayfinding section, how there was this broader idea of valuing observation as opposed to the use of technology and how that can help you navigate life. And one thing that came up for me as I was listening to this conversation is that in some cases, especially here where the conversation is an hour and a half long, chances are there will be sections of the thing that you're taking notes on that you're not deeply interested in. And in those cases, I don't feel any need to try to capture a lot of the details of those parts of the conversation. But what can be helpful in those cases is at least maybe capturing a few of those things in bullet point form. So in this case, there was a lot of talk about the direction that technology might be taking us over the next 5 years. And things like deep fakes and self-driving cars were brought up. And particularly in the case of self-driving cars, there was some extended conversation there that I wasn't super interested in, but I at least wanted to jot down the fact that those came up and that there was some conversation around those topics. So it might be the case that over 20 minutes of conversation, the only thing that shows up in your notes from those 20 minutes are 2 or 3 bullet points. There's nothing wrong with that. I also found that it was in this section that I started to get a little bit text heavy with my notes and trying to cram in more details than maybe was worth it. I feel like that happens fairly regularly, kind of in the middle of a sketchnoting session, once I'm into the ideas and enjoying the topic. It's easy for me to start to want to capture more words than is actually worth it. I also made a few mistakes as I finished filling this first of 2 pages of notes. A small mistake with kind of a summarizing phrase that I wrote down. My writing starts with daydreaming about the world you're creating. Since it was Hugh's idea that he was talking about, it should have been daydreaming about the world I'm creating, but that's not a big deal. I also wrote the word at 2 times in a row and decided just to cross it out. Small mistakes like that are kind of annoying, but aren't really that important when it comes to the overall impact of taking notes like this. So I think generally throwing the idea of perfection out the window is a good place to start when you're taking sketch notes. Now, considering how long this conversation was, I knew that I would probably want to go on to a second page, potentially even a third and fourth. In this case, it was just 2 pages that I stuck with. And as I entered this second page here, I did try to kind of keep in mind that I was getting a little bit text heavy. So try to start with visuals with each particular idea that I wanted to capture. And as we got to the section about self-publishing, it was nice to notice when Hugh was kind of identifying the things that make self-publishing an appealing option as opposed to traditional publishing. And in this case, I went with essentially a list, but instead of just a bullet point list with a star as each icon, I tried to come up with a custom icon for each of those kind of primary benefits, being creative freedom, more revenue from each sale, and the fact that you get to choose your editors. I also enjoyed creating this flowchart section where Hugh was telling the story about how his first self-published book got on the New York Times bestseller list, and that garnered attention from publishers. And I could kind of tell from the beginning that there was this story that he was telling that was going to have these different pieces to it. So whenever you kind of see that coming, it's kind of nice to be like, oh, this is a good opportunity for a flowchart here to capture the pieces of this story. And I can use a simple image and short phrase to capture each stage of that story, connect them with arrows, and also kind of just fill the space that I have available to me on the page, one element at a time. And with those arrows, I can kind of flexibly connect those pieces, no matter where the next one shows up on the page. And towards the end here, as I was taking these notes, kind of during the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation, felt good about sticking with just 2 pages here and didn't even worry about taking notes during the last 10 minutes or so, because by that point I had filled up the page and felt good about the number of ideas that I had captured here. So added in a few pieces just to let folks know that it was me who took these notes, and that for folks that want to explore this note-taking process, that's what I talk about at verbaltovisual.com. So overall, I really enjoyed how this sketchnoting session went. I was able to capture these ideas without pausing the conversation, even though I was tempted to a couple of times. But in this case, I feel like it's much more beneficial, at least in this particular note-taking session, to let the conversation keep flowing, because I knew that if I started pausing to do a little more detailed visual or capture a phrase in its exact form, that I would start doing that too frequently, and that would actually turn into a barrier to the note-taking process as opposed to something that's helpful. So I hope that you enjoyed seeing those notes come together and hearing a little bit about my process and some reflections on how it went. Now let's transition to a little bit of a summary of the ideas that came up, and specifically those that I chose to capture. I ended up taking 2 pages of notes here. Let's start with page 1. It started with a bit of the setting for the guest, Hugh Howey, on a boat in Australia during this trip around the world, and how wayfinding is one of the things that Hugh is interested in, which is all about navigating using natural signs as opposed to technology, which relies heavily on observation. And it was interesting to hear how that was kind of a helpful analogy for navigating life. Rather than relying on technology to help you navigate life, better to put the phones and computers away and do more paying attention to what's going on inside of you and around you. Thought that was kind of cool with my past at Wayfinding Academy. Shout out to that new college here in Portland, Oregon. They talked a bit about what Hugh has learned in his travels around the globe, how love of home is a constant, and how that kind of counters a little bit of his sense of wanderlust. But I kind of resonate with both of these ideas. I feel a bit of wanderlust myself, but also recently especially have enjoyed developing some roots. From there, the conversation turned to technology, and one phrase that stood out there is that technology is for our brain what sugar is for our gut, and how that is kind of impacting our attention span and our ability to consume information. But I like how Hugh pointed out that being on a boat when you don't have as much access access to that technology and information, that makes it a lot easier to have a longer attention span that isn't always interrupted by the ping of technology. He referenced a book by Kevin Kelly called What Technology Wants, which I'd heard before and I feel like might be one that I'd enjoy digging into. We talked a bit about where things are going within the next 5 years, specifically referencing deep fakes and self-driving cars, and how that latter one particularly is going to allow for a lot more free time, but we're also creating a whole lot of things to fill it with, like Netflix. So while technology does allow for more free time, we don't always fill that time with things like reading or writing or creating the things that we want to create because of how easy it is to fill our time with the consumption of easily available media. From there, they started talking about writing and Hugh's process a little bit and how that starts with daydreaming. Daydreaming about the world that he's creating and how for him it kind of helps to prevent the type of decision making that you might have to do while writing that could potentially get you off track. And as I'll bring in on the second page here, he likes to get to the point with this daydreaming where he's kind of already seen the movie in his head, and once he's gotten to that point, then it's just a matter of writing that movie down. I thought that was a cool way to explain what fiction writing can be like, and that ultimately to get the story down, you do have to put in the time, even if it is just an hour a day, because to write a book, you just got to write one paragraph at a time. So they continued on the topic of writing for the rest of the conversation, highlighting the dangers of comparing your first draft to the final draft of the authors that you admire and books that you love. Don't do that type of comparison. Also, the benefits of joining a writing group to get constructive feedback on your writing and give that feedback to others. And then from there, they talked about self-publishing. This was probably the last 35 to 40 minutes of the conversation, I think, that they dug into this topic, which I found to be very interesting because I probably will do it one day. The efficiency and lack of waste of print on demand and how it's kind of really matured and is in a good place right now since it's been around for about a decade or so. Some benefits of self-publishing being creative freedom that comes along with it, the fact that you get more revenue from each sale compared to traditional publishing, and you just have more choice overall. Choice of your editors, choice of pricing, choice of how to distribute it in some ways. And it was interesting too to hear a little bit of Hugh's story of how he self-published a book that got on the New York Times bestseller list, and that's what attracted some publishers, but all the offers that came in, they were really lowballed because he could see the numbers behind the scenes and how much he was making from each sale and in a given day, week, or month. And even though eventually these offers got to a point that were much more reasonable, by then he had seen the power of maintaining the rights to his work. And it got to the point where those rights became too valuable to sell, especially considering that these publishers, they don't have your interests solely in mind, especially in the long term. They're more concerned with their kind of entire portfolio of authors and books. And because of that, they might choose to price or distribute your book in a way that's not in your best interests, but instead the best interest for kind of that collective as a whole. So that's what made Hugh decide to maintain those rights. And from there, they kind of got a little bit into the nitty-gritty, how valuable it had been for him to price some short stories at a very low price, and I think in some cases give those away for free to get readers addicted to his writing. The dangers of watching your sales regularly. This resonates with me as a person who sells online courses because the negative impact of the dips, even temporary dips in sales, those have so much more of an impact than the positive reaction that you you have to spikes in sales. So he doesn't even watch his sales page anymore, and also mentioning how beneficial it is to kind of go down into the subcategories of Amazon's system, because at those subcategories, you get on the list of all of the parent categories as well. So there were a handful of real specific tips like that that came up. So those were my notes. You can explore more sketchnoting resources at verbaltovisual.com if you would like to learn how to take notes in a similar way. And after listening to that conversation and capturing those ideas, this definitely has me excited about doing my own writing and experimenting with self-publishing. And at this point, I don't think it's a matter of if I will do that. It's a question of when. I have a history of taking on too many creative projects at once, and at the moment I am very happy with what I'm making here at Verbal to Visual, and also a kind of behind the scenes podcast, The Doug Neill Show, about building a sustainable creative career. But I do appreciate hearing that really all it does take is an hour a day to write a book in a year. So I think I'll be on the lookout for where I can carve out that time to stop talking and thinking and dreaming about writing and just start doing it. I hope that you enjoyed following along with my process here and seeing some of the highlights of that conversation. Do go listen to the full thing. I've actually really enjoyed every episode of The Knowledge Project that I've chosen to listen to. I think this is the first time that I've sketchnoted it and shared some of the things that I've listened to there, but lots of other good episodes for you to listen to and maybe take notes on if you'd like to practice this skill. A good starting point to develop those skills is a course that I've created called An Introduction to Visual Note-Taking. In that course, I help you develop all of the individual skills involved in visual note-taking, and also how to bring those skills together to create your own note-taking process that works well for you. You can find links to that course down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to sharing some new ideas with you in the next video. Until then.